According to Bible prophecy, the Nile River in Egypt may be due for a cataclysm in the very near future. And here to talk with me about this subject and many others is Bob Ulrich. Hi, Bob.
Gary, how are you today?
I'm great, and we have a topic, a prophetic topic to talk about today that I think is one of the most exciting in the entire Bible. In fact, we have made it the feature article in our February magazine.
Well, it's a topic that's going to be somewhat controversial, I think, when people hear about it, because it's one of those Bible prophecy subjects that you've probably never heard about. Now, it's the feature article that Gary's written in the most recent edition of the Prophecy Watcher magazine, and the article is entitled "The Tower of Syene, a Prophetic Wonder." Now, Gary, this is a prophecy you've studied now for a few years about Egypt and the impending destruction of Egypt as prophesied in the Bible. Why don't you give us an overview of really what this is all about?
Well, it's prophecy that is found in Ezekiel 29, and the general heading of the prophecy is the desolation of Egypt, and it's a latter-day prophecy. Although it's addressed to Pharaoh, that is, when Ezekiel gives this prophecy, it's addressed to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, but the context of the prophecy is very clearly latter-day, and it talks about a catastrophe that befalls the Nile River that changes everything that the Nile River ever has been and ever will be. And it's such an unusual prophecy that I started studying it years ago, and I've written a couple of short pieces over the years, but I decided to write a longer article for the February edition of the Prophecy Watcher.
Now, the controversy with all this, some people say this is a prophecy that was fulfilled in the ancient past. How do you respond to that?
Well, the prophecy calls for the desolation of the land of Egypt over a period of 40 years, during which time no foot of man or beast will cross the land. And I don't know of any time like that, nor does anyone else in the history of Egypt. It's never really happened.
A 40-year period of complete and total, utter devastation and destruction.
Absolutely.
Now, what could possibly cause something like that so severe?
Well, that is the question. What could cause a land to be desolate for a 40-year period? And the prophecy goes on to say that when the people do return after that 40-year period, they will never again be a great people. In other words, Egypt will never thrive as a destination. And of course, it has thrived now for thousands of years. It's been a very wealthy place. It's sort of the crossroads of the world. It has rivers that can be traversed. Of course, the Nile River was always the lifeblood of the land. You could always fish the Nile. The waters pouring into the Mediterranean were rich as a fishery. The water, there was never a shortage of water for crops because the Nile reliably flooded every year, and it would fertilize the land, and you'd get great crops whether it rained or not. And yet, all that's begun to change, and it's due for a big change in the near future based on one thing. A dam was built some decades ago that changed the entire character of the Nile River.
Now, what's really critically important to understand about all this, and if you're new to our program, we do study the prophecies of the Bible here, many of them over 2,500 years, like this prophecy we're going to be talking about today. We compare them to things that are happening in this day and age. The really fascinating part about this prophecy, Gary, it's one of the only places in the Bible that actually references a physical location that didn't exist when the prophecy was written.
How true.
How do you explain that?
We're going to get to that in just a minute. First, you asked me a moment ago, how did I start studying this prophecy? Well, it went back to Ezekiel 38, the invasion of Israel by Gog and a variety of nations that have put in their fortunes with Gog and become if you will, an attack force into Israel. And the list of those nations that come with Gog is given in Ezekiel 38:5, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all of his bands, and many people with thee. You look at all that list of nations that come in the invasion with Gog, and you notice that one nation is missing. It's Egypt. For some reason, Egypt does not participate in the invasion of Israel. But here's the thing. The Egyptians and the Russians have been tight allies now for many, many decades. In fact, starting back at the beginning of the 20th century, they launched many projects together. One of the chief projects was the building of a dam across the Nile River. And that's where our story opens up.
And of course, one of the key things to remember is from the first day of Israel's existence, Egypt has been one of Israel's biggest enemies and participated in several of the battles, over the last many years.
So why wouldn't they be there? Well, Ezekiel 29 suggests why. Now let's talk about the river Nile, and that dam. It was a project that began really at the turn of the 20th century when the Russians built what was then called the Aswan Low Dam upstream from Cairo toward southern Egypt in the high country. They built a dam to contain the waters and possibly lay out the beginnings of a hydroelectric project. That was not completed until 1970 when the Russians built what's called the Aswan High Dam. And I'm going to read a few statistics. The Aswan High Dam is 12,570 feet in width. It's a big dam. It's from the base, it is 364 feet high. The base itself is 3,220 feet thick. It is a huge, huge dam. And it is a hydroelectric project. It has a number of generators totaling 175 megawatts of electric power that is directed all over Egypt. In other words, the Egyptians have all the free electricity they can get thanks to
the Russians.
So
what's the Russian motivation for wanting to come down to Egypt and help construct and finance that dam?
They want to expand. Ever since Peter the Great, the Russians have wanted to expand into the Middle East, particularly because they wanted warm water seaports, which they do not have. And so they extend their power any way they can find into the Middle East. And the Egyptians have been only too willing to allow the Russians to participate in the building of this dam. Well, that brings us to our Bible prophecy in Ezekiel 29. And this is so fascinating, Bob, when you begin to uncover it. And I'm going to turn there now into Ezekiel 29. This is a prophecy written by Ezekiel against Egypt. Ezekiel 29:3, speak and say, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I'm against thee, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lieth in the midst of his rivers, which hath said, my river is mine own, and I have made it for myself. So here's a riddle, a mystery. You have here a picture of a dragon lying in the Nile River, presumably submerged, because I don't know of anybody that's seen dragons, but somehow the spirit of the dragon is in the Nile River. And the dragon is boasting, and he says, the river is mine. I have made it for myself. First time I ever read that, I said, how can you make a river for yourself? And the next verse says, but I will put hooks in thy jaws, I will cause the fish of thy rivers to stick to thy scales, and I will bring thee up out of the midst of thy rivers, and all the fish of thy rivers shall stick to your scales, and I will leave thee thrown into the wilderness, thee and all the fish of thy rivers, and thou shalt be brought to the open fields, brought upon the open fields. Thou shalt not be brought together nor gathered. I have given thee for meat, that is for food, to the beasts of the field, the fowls of the heaven. In other words, this dragon who's lying in the middle of the Nile River is going to be destroyed. And all the inhabitants of Egypt shall know that I am the Lord, because they have been a staff of reed to the house of Israel. And Bob, that just really hit me. That's modern Egypt. Modern Egypt has made many, many mutual deals with the nation Israel. Mutual protection of Israel's southern border since 1948, for example. In every case, they have collapsed. Instead of helping Israel, they always pulled away. They posed as Israel's support, and they fell away every time. Exactly as this prophecy says, you've been a staff of reed to the house of Israel. When they took hold of thy hand, thou didst break, and rend upon their shoulder. And when they leaned upon thee, thou breakest and madest all their loins to be at a stand. In other words, you said you would help Israel, and there have been several peace deals, but every time war came, you didn't. This is so current in its scope. It's hard to believe. You read this, and you can just see today's news almost. And we have a therefore here in Ezekiel 29:8. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I will bring a sword upon thee, cut off man and beast out of thee, and the land of Egypt shall be desolate and waste, and they shall know that I am the Lord, because he said, the river is mine, and I have made it. Well, that statement, I think, chronicles the mutual construction pact that was made between the Egyptians and the Russians. This huge project, the Aswan High Dam project, literally allowed Egypt to say, the river is mine, I've made it, it's mine now, I control it, I've got this huge dam across it, it makes electricity, and besides that, we've got all the help of the Russians, all of their technical help, their monetary help, their army, and it's like making a pact with the devil, according to this prophecy. So, Bob, this is why this prophecy interested me.
Well, it interests me because of one little sentence in that verse where it says, I am against thee.
Yeah.
And those are words you do not want to hear.
No.
Where they're actually tempting God. And I go all the way back to ancient Egypt and the Pharaoh of the Exodus and how he treated the Israelites back then.
Sure.
This has continued down through history. Israel at various points has had some type of quasi-peace treaty with Israel, but they've always sought the destruction of Israel. They've never been a friend or someone who Israel can trust. And so here we have this dam that's built now. And things get interesting from here.
They really do. And again, not only do you have the dragon lying in the waters, in other words, there's an evil spirit about Egypt. The cooperation with another nation to build this huge dam, creating, by the way, Lake Nasser, 125 miles long. Huge, huge lake behind the dam. If that dam ever broke, Bob, wow.
Trillions of gallons of water, I would suspect.
That would flood the land. And this curse comes, according to God, because Egypt says, the river is mine. I've made it. Behold, therefore, I'm against thee and against thy rivers, and I will make the land of Egypt utterly waste and desolate, from the tower of Syene, even unto the border of Ethiopia. No foot of man shall pass through it, nor foot of beast shall pass through it, neither shall it be inhabited 40 years. And there it is. And I will make the land of Egypt desolate in the midst of the countries that are desolate, and her cities among the cities that are laid waste shall be desolate 40 years, and I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations, and I will disperse them through the countries. A war of some sort is going to happen.
Now, you just mentioned a peculiar phrase that people may not know, the Tower of Syene. I'm looking at it on the cover of our magazine, on this 5-page detailed article you've created with pictures and maps and an understanding of what is the Tower of Syene and how is it mentioned in the scriptures. Where did this come from?
Well, this is a tower of mutual peace between the Russians and the Egyptians that was placed upon the Aswan High Dam. When the dam was completed, dedicated in 1970, they built, and we'll have beautiful pictures for you to see, they built the Lotus Tower. It has 5 petals that come up, and it's supposed to sort of be an imitation of the lotus that blooms in the Nile River. It may actually be a reference to the 5 pillars of Islam, but whatever it is, it's called the Lotus Tower, and it's engraved with all kinds of memorials at its base, commemorating the cooperative project between the Russians and the Egyptians to create this wonderful hydroelectric flood control project. By the way, farming in Egypt has never been the same since, because the river used to flood annually, giving bumper crops. It doesn't happen anymore. Fishing has changed too. There's not the kind of fishing there used to be, but there's lots of electricity. And so when this dam was finished, they commemorated it with the Lotus Tower, beautiful tower that's 300 and some feet high. And
It's a tourist attraction. I mean, people actually come to see it. It's a beautiful structure.
it is. And this tower commemorates the Aswan High Dam. Let me read this verse again. This is Ezekiel 29:10. Behold, therefore I am against thee, against thy rivers, and will make the land of Egypt utterly waste and desolate, from the tower of Syene even unto the border of Ethiopia. Now, it is a grammatical fact that the word Syene in English and Aswan in English come from the same cognate, Savina in the Hebrew, but our word Aswan, as in Aswan High Dam, and Syene are virtually the same word. In other words, the Bible here is speaking of the commemorative tower that stands atop the Aswan High Dam. It did not exist before 1970 when it was built.
Which is phenomenal.
It is.
Bible prophecy at its core. History written in advance.
History written in advance. Ezekiel wrote centuries before Christ about a tower that would be destroyed in the far, far future. And the destruction of the Tower of Syene would render Egypt totally waste and barren for a period of 40 years.
Now, if you were to look at a satellite photo of Egypt at night, you'd see lights all along the Nile River.
Yeah.
And literally follow the population center of Egypt right along the Nile, just like it's always been.
That's right, because Egypt is a desert country except for the banks of the Nile. And that's where the population always has been, going all the way up to Aswan. And of course, when the Aswan High Dam was built and Lake Nasser is behind it, now you have this enormous lake, over 100 miles in length. And you can imagine how much water is in that thing. And
Now, this dam is so big, it's been called indestructible.
yes.
I mean, literally indestructible. It's just massive. And this leads us to, maybe part of the key critical part of the prophecy moving forward.
And I put this in the article, documentation about strategic military positions in the Middle East. From the moment that the Aswan High Dam was built and dedicated back in 1970, and you may remember that Israel's statehood came in 1948, and 22 years or so after Israel's statehood, this huge dam was dedicated. Egypt was at war periodically with Israel, and a lot of Israel's military planners said, if you want to eliminate Egypt as an enemy, all you have to do is blow that dam. You'd flood the entire country. The objection came, people said, it's too big to blow up. It's huge. It's 12,000 feet wide. It's 3,000 feet thick. You can't blow that up with explosives. Oops, but you can. And a couple of Israeli leaders, and I have them in the article, you'd be able to read in detail about their discussions, said, no, you could blow up that dam with nuclear weapons.
Strategic military planning. And of course, the nation of Israel is famous for looking forward into the future and examining their enemies and strategies to defend themselves.
Right. And so if you blew up the dam with nuclear weapons, and one or two small ones would do it, the suitcase type, what would be the result? And many people have talked about the result. The result would be, and you can just visualize it, the dam would rise into the air in clouds of dirt and concrete and debris, and then Lake Nasser would be unleashed and would take all that debris at high speed northward from the rivers of Ethiopia, that is the White Nile and the Blue Nile, just like Ezekiel says in his prophecy, from the rivers of Ethiopia all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And it would be nuclear-infused radioactive water.
Trillions of gallons of radioactive
Trillions of
water
gallons of radioactive.
flooding the entire nation of Egypt. What else could make it completely uninhabitable for 40 years? Now, I want to talk about that next, about when this is going to happen, because I know people are really interested in this, and I'm sure we're going to hit comments that say, well, 40 years, I don't want to be here for another 40 years, Gary. And let's talk about that. But I want to show you this magazine first, because this arrived this morning. Ironically, it just couldn't be better timing with the Tower of Syene on the cover. This is a publication that we offer each month for an annual subscription, believe it or not, of just $19.95 a year. Now, where do you get a magazine for $19.95 a year anymore? Beautiful four-color magazine that's got not only Gary's extensive writings, but articles by literally a dozen of the leading prophetic minds in the world today. We write, just to give you an idea of the cover, Bill Salas writes, "Is America found in Ezekiel 38, the Battle of Gog and Magog?" Avi Lipkin, Saudi Arabia and Iran are facing off. Ken Johnson, who's become a regular writer for us, writes about Enoch's 7,000-year plan for mankind. Daniel Wright writes about Golgotha. Danny Ben-Gigi talks about the Hebrew language, the secrets that you can find within the Hebrew Bible. I've written about the patterns of evidence, the Exodus, ironically, which is part of the history of Egypt here. So for $19.95 a year, you can get 12 issues of this magazine, biggest bargain in the world of Bible prophecy, with one exception. You can get this magazine for a lifetime. Become a charter subscriber to the Prophecy Watcher for just $100, a one-time tax-deductible donation. You can get this magazine every month. Keep it coming, literally, for the rest of your life. So where are you going to find a deal that good?
Or until the rapture, which may come first.
More importantly, you can get Gary's article on the Tower of Syene,
Absolutely.
which is really powerful. Now, let's talk about when this happens, because I know this is really critical to the article, when this actually takes place.
Before I do, that remark about the rapture I made on purpose, Bob, because here at Prophecy Watchers, we defend the tradition of the pre-tribulational, premillennial, dispensationally derived rapture of the church before the tribulation. We are still holding firm to that position, despite the fact that many people have moved in other directions. We're holding to that classic position. Bob, to answer your question, I do believe that the rapture comes before the tribulation. The question then, where would you put this event? And I want to go back to Ezekiel 38 again, because we have the invasion of Israel by Gog. And the allies of Gog, Ezekiel 38:5, Persia, Ethiopia, which is south of Egypt, still participates in this invasion. Egypt's not there, but Ethiopia is, because it's above the dam level. Right. It would not be covered with radioactive water. Libya, Northeast Africa, is still there because it lies to the west of the River Nile. Gomer and all his bands, the House of Togarmah, would not be affected, so they are all Confederate in the invasion. The invasion itself...
And of course, they all have one thing in common.
The destruction of Israel.
They're all Islamic nations,
Yes.
who are hell-bent on destroying Israel.
And as you look at Ezekiel 38, which is not that many chapters beyond Ezekiel 29, you look at this invasion, and you read Ezekiel 38:18, and it shall come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. Now, I interpret this to mean that coincident with this huge military invasion of Israel, God says, my fury, that is my wrath, will come up in my face. I read this to indicate that the onset of the 7-year tribulation period occurs somewhere in the beginning of that invasion of Israel. maybe a year after the beginning of the invasion, maybe 6 months, we don't know for sure, but somewhere coincident with Gog's invasion of Israel, the tribulation begins. And this means that also coincident with the beginning of the tribulation, the Nile is destroyed.
So do you think Ezekiel is written chronologically? You referenced earlier in the article about the chapter before Ezekiel 29 referencing Satan.
Yeah.
And then Ezekiel 29 and the Tower of Syene. And here we come to Ezekiel 38. So it seems like there's a timeline that's built into the book.
There is a kind of a timeline. I don't know that you can make a year-by-year layout, but you can put together an approximate timeline that apparently the destruction of the Nile River begins prior to the invasion of Israel by Gog. And that makes sense, because that would be a stimulus. If somebody blew that Aswan High Dam with nuclear weapons, all bets are off.
Especially if it were Israel.
Especially if it happened to be Israel. That would start everything. And of course, if you read Ezekiel 38 and 39, you see that what begins as the invasion of Israel boils up into an international melee. In fact, Ezekiel later on says, and I will send fire on Magog and among them that dwell carelessly in the isles. That would be us. In other words, the war spreads all over the world. Its beginning may be the destruction of the Tower of Syene. That is the Aswan High Dam. And again, what Ezekiel wrote about centuries before Christ didn't even come into existence until 1970. I think that's amazing.
It is. You know, God can see the future. We certainly can't. We can see what he's given us and what he's written in the pages of the Bible. But to see this and actually see a reference to a physical location, you know, some 2,500 plus years, you know, written beforehand, just really should make people really sit up and take notice that God certainly does know the future. The other key point to remember is we don't know where Egypt is going to be a month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now. With the confusion and the chaos in the Middle East, Egypt is one of the countries under attack, as is Jordan, as in Saudi Arabia. Who knows what's going to happen with ISIS and all of the Muslim Brotherhood relationships and where this is all going to come. And the reason I say that is, what would lead Israel to bomb the dam?
ISIS is moving southwestward, and that's right toward the corner of Africa, the Horn of Africa, Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia. That's where the action is going to be. And Bob, that's why I think we're getting closer in a hurry.
We are getting closer rapidly.
Hey, it's been interesting to talk to you today, and to me this is exciting because we can see God's hand in the world of today. And it's just amazingly exciting to study the Bible and Bible prophecy. Glad you could join us today. I'm Gary Stearman. Keep watching. We are. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com, where you can sign up for our free email newsletter. Keep watching, everybody, and we'll see you soon.